Legislation process. So we not here today to talk, we're here to talk to do. I would like to tell you thank you first. Thank you for coming. This event is organized by Wate Debate organization. And my name is Dadielo, and I'm the president and the founder of Wate Debate organization. And I would like to first thank some people that I don't see here yet, but I'm pretty sure they're on the way. I'm talking about Wanji Blesseri and Mr. Marcel Doué. Both people are leading the Conseil National Ivoirien. It's thanks to them we're here today. Also, I would like to notice the presence of my elder, Ambassador Pascal Kokora, who's taking some time out to be here today. Thank you, Ambassador. And thank you for everybody. Also, I want to notice the presence of Mrs. Christy Arendt from the State Department. She's here to help us with understanding more the U.S. position on what happened in Cote d'Ivoire and how the reconciliation process is going. So thank you, Mrs. Arendt. That brings me to thank our panelists. And thank you for not slapping me, because I know I bothered you, all of you, calling you day and night, and you always pick up whenever I call. So thank you, and thank you for coming. Today we're here to reflect on one theme: national reconciliation in Cote d'Ivoire. For those who don't understand, who don't speak French, Cote d'Ivoire means in English, Ivory Coast. Thank you. And we're gonna look at the perspective and the way forward in the reconciliation process. As we get out of this room today, we will have to come up with some solutions to help the present Ivorian government, or should I say, the people of Cote d'Ivoire, to reconcile, because after all, they need to reconcile and there's no way out. So we're here to suggest some solution. Let me just point out that today's solutions that are going to be generated by our speakers as well as the audience, the solutions are going straight to Cote d'Ivoire, the National Assembly of Cote d'Ivoire, and also we're going to suggest the solution to the commission that is in charge of the reconciliation process in Cote d'Ivoire. So we're not here today to talk. We're here to talk to do. So keep that in mind when you suggest something, because it's going to help about 25 million people in Cote d'Ivoire. But before we get to the reconciliation process, the question is, what brought about the reconciliation process? People just don't reconcile. They reconciled when they were deconciled, meaning when they were separated in some ways, where there was some trouble among them. So let me briefly, and I know the panel is gonna reflect more on that, but let me briefly tell you what I know. I thought I should scratch on the surface of the issue. And so don't kill the messenger, because I'm just a scratcher. The second tour of the presidential election in Cote d'Ivoire in 2010 resulted in the proclamation of two presidents. One, the challenger Alassane Ouattara was proclaimed winner of the election by the National Electoral Commission and certified by the United Nations, while the incumbent, Mr. Gbagbo Lora, was proclaimed by the Constitutional Council, the highest institution recognized by the Constitution of Cote d'Ivoire, to proclaim the last result of a presidential election in Cote d'Ivoire, according to experts. All negotiations that followed this political standoff did not ease the tensions. The National Armed Forces clashed with the rebels who previously took sanctuary in the center of and the north of the country after an unsuccessful coup d'etat of September 2002. The outcome of this clash is heavy in casualty. The United Nations counts about 3,000 people dead, while the other sources reach 5,000. On April 11, 2012, President Gbagbo was arrested by the rebels or by the French, depending on which side of the issue you are. And as we speak, is a standing trial at The Hague in the Netherlands. The national reconciliation enacted by President Ouattara government has now produced a positive outcome for the people. People of Cote d'Ivoire are more than ever divided, and this isn't my opinion. It is an observation from several experts. So, what is blocking the reconciliation process? What are the potential solutions applicable to such obstacles? And to discuss this, to discuss those pertinent questions and more, we have a prominent scholars and humanitarians on our panel. Now, let me start with presenting our panel. And to be gallant, I would say let's start with the ladies. We have Dr. Bernadette Paolo. She's a CEO and president of Africa Society. And if you need more information about her or a biography, my Luro staff is distributing the biography right now that you can take time to read. So she's going to reflect on the humanitarian, she's going to show the conflict and the reconciliation process in the political context. Then we have Bintu Jessica Diomande. Bintu Jessica Diomande is the acting president of United Aid for Africa. And she's going to reflect on the humanitarian aspect of the conflict and the reconciliation process. We have Dr. Raymond Gelpin. He's a director of the Center for Sustainable Economies at the United States Institute of Peace. He's going to discuss the economic impact of the reconciliation process. And finally, we have Dr. Eric Marshall Eddy. Dr. Eddy is an affiliated faculty of global studies at the Loyola University in Maryland. His presentation is going to focus on the constitutional aspect of the crisis and the lacking element of the reconciliation. So with that, let me just give you a few more things and I'll let the panel to start. They all will have a 10-minute presentation and later have a 20 minutes of commenting on each other's points. And after that, we're going to take the last hour for the Q&A session. Because I know Our audience had a lot of questions, so I'm going to give you enough time to ask any kind of question, and Mrs. Arendt here from the State Department to help us with some answers, in case we might be a little confused. So thank you one more time. And with that, I'm going to call Dr. Paolo to come to present a paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you, Dottie Lowe, President of the Wate Debate organization. Thank you for organizing this. It's a very timely moment on national reconciliation in Cote d'Ivoire, perspectives and the way forward. To my fellow panelists, I'm glad to be here with you. I'm glad I'm sitting next to Dr. Ray Gilpin. And there's something wrong with this. We have the Ivorians on one side and the Americans here. Maybe we can merge in the middle after our presentations. I have one point of clarification. I am an attorney, not a PhD. And I say that because in the United States, we're not doctors. And sitting next to Dr. Gilpin, I have to make that distinction. I'm just going to talk very quickly. I'm glad that I'm here, and I'll tell you what I think is why I think that our presence, the Africa Society, will be meaningful today. We worked with Cote d'Ivoire Watch. Cote d'Ivoire Watch was formed, and Bintu was in there right after the elections took place in 2010 by a woman named Vivian Derrick, and it was a coalition of nonprofit organizations, Ivorians. We were briefed every week by the Department of State, and we worked with members of Congress. And the purposes were simple. We wanted to restore order and democracy to Cote d'Ivoire. And so we monitored the situation. We worked, we drafted legislation. And then the Africa Society, with Ambassador Diabate, convened a forum at Howard University with representatives from the Gbagbo family who were in the audience at a very dramatic time that was televised throughout Africa. So we've worked very hard on Cote d'Ivoire, and I'm glad to be following up right now. We all know that the elections were deemed free and fair, and everyone sitting in this audience knows what evolved as a result of those elections going awry. Escalating violence, political instability, deplorable human conditions, 90,000 refugees in Liberia, and a steadily rising death toll resulted from Mr. Gbagbo's ability to violate the rule of law with impunity. It's fortuitous then that this takes place at the same time that Mr. Gbagbo is being tried in the ICC. Now, that was then. What we all know what happened then, and we all know what's happening now. But it's far more complicated than that if we look at the situation that it evolves since then. Security sector reform in Cote d'Ivoire is slow. And if you have a national reconciliation process, you have to have security reform first. And the fact that there's still people who are under arrest in Ghana, and that those borders are not as safe as they should be, is a problem for the government of Cote d'Ivoire. And there are lots of recommendations that we'll go over shortly about how to fix that if we were in that situation. But I think that a security system must be in place that's adjudged by civilians to be free and fair, not in allegiance to any political party. So how do you do that? We also know that Mr. Gbagbo's forces were not the only ones who were committing atrocities, and that there were human rights violations by Mr. Ouattara's forces also. Those violent outbreaks are still taking place. And they necessitate an ongoing regional cooperation, certainly with presidents of Liberia and Ghana, perhaps Togo, on border collaboration, particularly given what's happening in Mali. There are also, there's given the instability that we're seeing in West Africa, period, all of these measures have to take place. And there are a lot of commonalities. We see the French now in Mali, and the French were asked to be in Mali. We see the division between the north in Mali and the south, and we see a division in Cote d'Ivoire between the north and the south. So we have to be mindful of these similarities and learn from the lessons that we see unfolding daily in front of us. There could not be a national reconciliation process that's meaningful without establishing a judicial system, the rule of law, a rule of law that is credible and an equal application of the law. And certainly we know that you have to build a strong civil society. Disarmament in Cote d'Ivoire, in my estimation, is proceeding slowly, as is the repatriation of refugees. A unification process that can be established by creating forums for discussion of the existing situation should be implemented with an eye toward, the grassroots level. We have this problem of rural communities and the integration of those communities within societies, and that requires educational campaigns and engagement. So we also have to focus on educating youth and providing opportunities so as to create hope. Now, the bulk of my presentation, it seems as though Dr. Gilpin, working at the Institute of Peace, these are points that he would make generally, but he's going to be talking on a different topic, thankfully. In the architects of any mechanism, when they're trying to establish a process for reconciliation in the hope to galvanize peace and stability, you have to, especially when there's histories of wars, violence, and hardship, the process has to address justice. And it has to heal traumatic damages of the past and the negative impacts of a conflict. And strangely enough, there has to be a budget for this. I mean, this is an expensive process, because when you're trying to find redress, you have to help in the healing process. There are medical issues that you have to contend with. There are judicial issues. There are people who have been displaced from their homes. So it is, in fact, a process, and it has to be comprehensive and sustainable. So a national reconciliation is healing, and that's the first step in nationhood, in building and in starting this process we call nationhood. So you have to account for what happened during the conflict, seeking justice for those who were wronged, and promoting peaceful reconciliation. So I alluded to the fact that Lawrence Gbagbo is before the ICC, and we know that Mrs. Gbagbo is still in Cote d'Ivoire. And we know that a lot of people who were aligned with Mr. Gbagbo are in jail. But I'm sure that the application of law has to be fair. So we also have to look at Mr. Ouattara and his government making sure that those people who were aligned with him are also brought to justice for this trust to ensue. Because once a country heads on this path and they have fundamental psychological adjustments in a group and individual identity, that's when the healing begins. Right now in Cote d'Ivoire, we still have security forces that were aligned with Mr. Gbagbo, security forces that were aligned with Mr. Ouattara. We have huntsmen, I think 18,000, the pronunciation is Dosos, is that correct? Dosos? Dozo, roaming around. And so this security apparatus has to be remedied so that a national reconciliation process ensues. And as I said, coupled with a justice system. When you do fact-finding and you have to provide justification, it takes time. We in America, I'll speak for myself, I'm impatient when it comes to change. We want elections right away. We want healing right away. It doesn't work like that. So sustained violence then that we've seen, it's caused communities and ethnic groups to have a sense of group identity and victimization. And once you feel that you're a victim, you don't heal overnight. And so these traumas lead to destructive political dynamics. And so they become enemies and locked in those conflicts. Now, in all fairness to, and I'm going to conclude very shortly because I think we're here to talk and to learn from one another and to have an exchange that results in us coming up with recommendations that can be taken back and hopefully implemented, if not in the short term, then in the longer term. The beneficiaries of any process before you embark on it have to be identified. That's a very important thing. We hear about truth and reconciliation as though we can jump in it and make friends with people right away, heal wounds, when people have had their family members killed, where some of their family members are in Liberia, where they have no access to education, where they're not being fed, and then we say, let's play nice, come together, kumbaya. It doesn't, and the effective victims then are not necessarily the affluent people in towns that you see or in cities, but those on the periphery. So I'm just going to give targeted recommendations or some recommendations on the reconciliation process itself and make just a few other comments before I do that and allude to what we see happening in Mali. Personally, I think the French intervention in Mali is a very good thing at the time that it happened. The resolution that we saw would have been in September, and by that time, it could be argued that Mali, as we know it, would be overtaken. But in the long term, an outside force can't create stability in a country. The country has to own that process. At the same time, we saw what happened in Cote d'Ivoire in the French intervention. We also hear what Mr. Gbagbo is saying at the ICC, that this is a French plot, which in my view is ridiculous. If you don't want outside intervention, then you have to have your house in order and do not allow for the wholesale slaughter of people. I think that a weak state can leverage its histories and cultures. And you know, this religious, ethnic violence that we see playing out, or certainly separation, wasn't always the case in Cote d'Ivoire. In some countries, that's been endemic in their cultures. It wasn't before. And so bridging that it won't be as difficult as I think as it is the political identity fragmentation that is the hallmark of a lot of states. It is not as prevalent, in my view, in Cote d'Ivoire. And so I think that the first thing we have to do then is to make sure that you include all aspects of your society, whether it's the Muslims in the north, people in the rural communities, and to have cohesive groups of people who have long common histories coming together. And we already know that after there's been violence, there's a shortage of trust. How do you bridge that trust? I think that democratic systems have to have trust. And where there's little trust, you really can't achieve a reconciliation process. In all fairness to President Ouattara, it's hard to be even-handed and to try to bring other people at the highest levels in when at the same time you have coup attempts that are ongoing, that are reported, and you have this history of security forces that are fighting one another. So the very nature then of a formal state frequently exacerbates this problem. So Cote d'Ivoire is going to have to come up with its own system. It doesn't have to be a westernized system. It can be a prescription that works for Cote d'Ivoire. And that's what what has to happen in the future. So finally, I think they have to speed up the redeployment of police and provide them with a significant budget. I think that you have to organize a national conference to bring people together, combined with, as I said, this regional conference that brings heads of state together and talks about security and cooperation, particularly at this time. You have to publicly declare what these deadlines are for demobilization in the future. And so that you can, and you also have to reinsert former combatants and give them something to do. And have available economic opportunities, which I hope that we'll go into later, we will go into. So basically, you're going to have a national legal framework. I think I'll stop there, and we will talk more about how this can be done realistically. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for making that comment about your status as a doctor or not. And because I saw the DD, for me it was okay, you
yes,
call a doctor too. Now I'm calling Bintu Jessica Jumande.
Thank you, Mr. Lowe, for inviting me here today, and thank you the panel, thank you the audience for taking your time and come here to be part of this very important discussion. My name is Bintu Diamande, and I am an Ivorian. I am also the president of the United Aid for Africa Foundation, which is engaged in community improvement, social change, and human rights. I was also member of Cote d'Ivoire Watch, which is a non-partisan coalition of Washington, D.C., whose main purpose was to find solutions to the Ivorian crisis. Among many other things, Cote d'Ivoire Watch urged the U.S. government to lobby for more aid for the victims on the ground, mainly women and children. That's why I would like to use this opportunity to thank the member of Cote d'Ivoire Watch, especially the non-Ivorian who stood by the Ivorian. I remember one day, let me take this opportunity as well to thank one special member of Cote d'Ivoire Watch. She is a strong woman. She is a role model for me. I remember one day sitting in her office, crying because I couldn't take it anymore, to see my people dying, but she stood by me. This woman is Bernadette Paulo. So please join me to thank her for me. Please join me to thank her. Yes, it was very hard. It was very, very hard for me as an Ivorian. It was also hard for the people of Cote d'Ivoire, all the people in Cote d'Ivoire. At that time, when I get home and turn on my TV and see the body of my people laying out in the street or being dumped in the trunk of truck like garbage, I couldn't believe it was a country I left years ago. This beautiful country of peace, of love, of joy. Cote d'Ivoire used to be a success story. It used to be the pride of Africa. It used to practice democracy. We used to live in peace. I remember the first president of Cote d'Ivoire, the father of the nation, who used to say, la paix, ce n'est pas un mot, c'est un comportement. C'est un comportement. Which means peace isn't just a word. Peace is a behavior. Peace is a way of living, a way of everyday living, by loving your country, by loving your neighbor, by working together. by respecting each other's opinion, by welcoming immigrants. Cote d'Ivoire was a success story. It used to enjoy economic boom and social development. By the 1970s, Cote d'Ivoire became the largest producer of cocoa in the world. Many people coming from all over Africa, from Senegal, from Burkina Faso, or from Mali, from Guinea, even from Lebanon, entered Cote d'Ivoire to achieve economic advancement for themselves and their family. This is how immigrants settle in the country with Ufobonyi blessing. Cote d'Ivoire used to be the land of opportunity. It used to be called Petit Paris, which means little Paris. Not that we want to be little for anything. Yes, this is how Cote d'Ivoire used to be under Ufobonyi. The country of Akwaba, the country of the welcome. Unfortunately, this success story didn't last long. It didn't. In 2002, the conflict started dividing the country in two between the north and the south. It gets even worse after this disputed election 2011. I'm telling you, 3,000 people died. 3,000 people died. 700,000 people fled their home. It was tragic. Women were raped. Family was separated and children were hungry. The whole conflict actually lasted 10 years, but its actual damage cost us far more than 10 years. Those kids will grow with hatred, anger, and will for revenge. So we have work to do. We have work to do. I know. We all gathered here today because we would like to find a solution to the national reconciliation, which is very important. But I think it is even more important. It is even more important to find the source of the problem before even thinking about moving ahead. I'll tell you, we are bounded to repeat the same mistake if we don't find the source of the problem and fix it. For me, there are two main sources of the problem. The first one is political manipulation. The second one is the misconception of the true meaning of democracy. So, what do I mean by political manipulation? Politicians, selfish and greedy politicians, will use some xenophobic political policy to divide us, such as that concept of ivoirité, which played on that concept of ivoirité played on ethnic tension for what was labeled as real citizens. As a result of that concept of ivoirité, some people will be classified as second-class citizens just based on where they come from. The concept of ivoirité will create an increased civil tension among us. Like I said, the second source of the problem, the misconception of the true meaning of democracy. Politicians, yes, again, politicians. They will go to a region. They will go talk to the people of that region. They will bribe them. They will tell them, vote for me because we are from the same region, religion, or tribe. I said no. Because that won't help us grow the economy. That will help the youth who went to high school, university, graduated, but cannot find jobs. That will help mom and pop to afford food to put on the table. That's why, my brothers and sisters, it is time we go to the villages. We go talk to the people in the villages to vote based on record, especially to vote based on moral integrity. We want to make sure the future president, the next president, put the people first, put the life of the people first. We want to make sure the next president avoids any decision that will put in danger the life of even one person. My brothers and sisters, we shouldn't let politicians take advantage of us. We shouldn't let divide us. That's why we must reconcile for the future of Cote d'Ivoire. We have no choice. We must reconcile. The good news is 2% of its population under the age of 14. So we must do everything in our power to educate those kids to become better leaders of tomorrow. They have to learn to respect each other's ideas and opinions. I will close by saying that we can either choose to blame each other, or we can start moving the country ahead to build a strong nation that will, once again, become the hope of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Diomande. Thank you so much. Now I'm calling Dr. Gelbe.
Thank you very much, Daddy, and thank you to the organization for putting this event together. Before I start, I'd like to just, for the record, say I'm speaking on my personal behalf, and the remarks I will make reflect my personal views and not the views of any institution with which I'm affiliated. When Daddy first called me, I have an aversion to many meetings to discuss the same thing over and over again and not get to any solution. And so I must admit I was a bit apprehensive at the start, because Washington, D.C., particularly Massachusetts Avenue, is the home of the interminable discussion, with all due respect to these hallowed surroundings. But I thought about it, and when he told me it's going to be a discussion, more of an exchange of ideas, I became a lot more interested, because issues like national reconciliation are very complex anywhere in the world, but particularly in Cote d'Ivoire, which was my home for 3 years while I worked for the African Development Bank. I lived in Abidjan and enjoyed the largesse and beauty of a great nation. But I also observed the political currents as they changed. I also observed society as it hardened towards a civil war. I was there just before hostilities actually broke out. And so I think that there's a lot that could be achieved through dialogue and exchange of ideas, and also trying to attack the issue from different perspectives. So what I'm going to be doing today is looking at things through an economic and financial lens. I'm going to be very brief because I think the value of my being here is one to listen and learn, but also to participate during the Q&A. I think that's where you really get to the meat of the issues. National reconciliation, when we think about it in the Ivoirian context, you go back to the Makusi 1, 2, 3, Pretoria 1, 2, etc. It's basically looking at the political and the security side. Most of the provisions. But what is the end state of national reconciliation? It should be a marked difference in the lives and livelihood of every Ivorian citizen. That is the baseline. That has a political dimension, it has a security dimension, but it also has an economic dimension, which we overlook and we tend to misunderstand. I want to talk about three main things very quickly, and then give you 4 issues I think that we should be considering as we discuss efforts towards national reconciliation in Cote d'Ivoire. The 3 issues I want to discuss is that, first of all, the previous speaker talked about the root causes of the conflict. I think that in Cote d'Ivoire, we have focused a little too much on economic growth and not on economic development. Cote d'Ivoire is structurally unlike almost any African economy. Most African economies, you have 1 commodity or 2 commodities that lead the economy. In Cote d'Ivoire, you have a strong service sector led by finance and the travel and tourism industries. You have a strong mining sector, manufacturing sector. You also have a strong agricultural sector. Look across the continent and find a country that has such a strong diversity. And because of that, economic growth rates have been good. 2012, the estimate for economic GDP growth in Cote d'Ivoire is 8.6%. 8.6. This year, the estimate is going to be somewhere around, for 2013, 6%. But I'll ask you, how does that translate into micro gains for the families? How does that translate into community development? Because of that gap between macro indicators and micro reality, we have an imbalance in the economy and an imbalance in economic prospects for the Ivorians. Secondly, the second major cause I see is that both infrastructure and reputation have taken a huge hit. If you break down the GDP figures for last year, you will find out that things like the service industry, things like tourism, things like financial services did poorly. What carried the economy was mining, gold, and a little bit of an upsurge in cocoa. That has a lot to do with both infrastructure and reputation. And if those 2 things are not addressed and addressed quickly, you're not going to have the kind of economy that's going to sustain shared prosperity in the years ahead. The third economic cost of conflict that is an underlying issue and a big hurdle for Cote d'Ivoire as it moves ahead is that the political economy of conflict still persists. And it will continue to persist even after you sign the next piece of code or you move ahead. Why? Because a lot of economic decisions are no longer made on the basis of price, competition, or demand and supply. They're made on the basis of group identity. They're made on the basis of a monopoly of control. They're made on the basis of group or state predation. That is not a recipe for progress in the years ahead. So that's my prism. And what could we do? What sort of agenda could we conceive for the years ahead? that would support true national reconciliation. I have 4 issues I'll go over very quickly. First, I think the paradigm has to shift from an overwhelming focus on the public sector and public sector activity to efforts that help boost private sector, the private sector contribution. If you look at the 2012 to 2015 National Development Plan for Cote d'Ivoire, you'll notice that a lot of the investments are public sector in orientation. And we know what happens with public sector procurement contracting. What we want is a lot more emphasis on the ingenuity and risk-taking of Ivorian business people. Linking Ivorian business people with global markets, transfers of technology, and building capacity. So that paradigm shift from an overwhelming focus on the public sector to building the private sector is essential, because that not only increases economic productivity, but it also spreads the benefits of economic growth to a wider pool of people. The second thing that we need to do is focus more on entrepreneurship, and that's private sector development. Third thing we need to do is we need to understand unemployment in Cote d'Ivoire, particularly youth unemployment. If you were to ask me what's the youth unemployment rate in Cote d'Ivoire, I'll say, I don't know, which is true. No one really knows, because measurements vary from place to place. But if you break down that youth unemployment, you'll start to understand the link between unemployment and conflict in Cote d'Ivoire a bit better. A survey that was done in 2006 broke down youth unemployment for the 15 to 30 year category. What they found was that a huge amount of people had no jobs. But for the few 41 that had jobs, 68% of them were working without a contract. 68% without a contract. So even those who are employed have no hope for the future, because they're working without any prospects for benefits or any prospects for sustained employment in this area. So when we talk about bolstering employment in Cote d'Ivoire, it's not just about numbers or statistics trying to bring the unemployment rate down. It's about providing meaningful opportunities for the youth. And how do we do this? Another important issue about unemployment in Cote d'Ivoire, and this you're finding a lot in North Africa at the moment, there are many similarities, is that there is a structural mismatch between the labor force and the economy. You have people graduating university with degrees, but without the skills that Cote d'Ivoire's economy requires. And this demands a revisit of the curriculum, this demands alternative training, this takes time. You might say, oh, well, where do we start? If we had started in 2005, we'll be graduating the first batch of people who are meeting those requirements now. So I'll say the time to start thinking about it is now. Because without that important demographic, the 15 to 30-year-old, believing that reconciliation is not only going to mean that the fighting stops and that the politics is corrected, but that they're going to have a future. If that never happens, we'll be having this same conversation in 10 years' time. The last thing I would suggest in terms of the economic dimension of making national reconciliation meaningful is we need to find ways to integrate Cote d'Ivoire's micro and small and medium-scale enterprises with the main economic drivers. And what do I mean? I mentioned earlier that you have a number of strong economic pillars, but you don't have inclusion. How does the person selling water on the streets relate to the financial, the big financial industries? Or how does the transportation operator relate to the mines? There's a lot of work that has been done, and USAID has done a lot of interesting work in this area. It's called a value chain analysis. Somebody needs to, step back, look at all the main economic drivers, and it's more complicated in Cote d'Ivoire because you have so many. Take a look at the value chain and see how much more of the value chain you can keep within Cote d'Ivoire. And then find entry points for the person who runs a mom and pop shop, for the person who has a transportation business, for the person who has a food and recreational business, so that they are more integrated in the main economic drivers. Because one of the key economic issues and hurdles for reconciliation is not just equity, but also inclusion. There's been a politics of inclusion, but a continued mechanism that excludes a wide proportion of Ivorians from that 8.6% GDP growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gilpin. And now, Dr. Eddie Mario is going to give us the last speech.
Thanks. I don't know where you get my middle name from. I usually don't go by that, but all that is fine. Let me thank the other panelists for all that has been said in here. We have a lot of points that we share in common, and others that we certainly will disagree on. The first thing I want to say is that the debate today is not taking the form of a debate, which is a good thing, but is taking the form of a profound discussion on the Ivory Coast. And I think that the dynamics today has changed with two things, I believe. The number one thing is what happened yesterday at The Hague, with the intervention, the speech of Mr. Laurent Gbagbo, from president who is, standing trial at The Hague. The second thing that has changed the dynamic today, and what I say the dynamic, is what I heard from Bernadette about the point of view of African society, right? Is the recent reports that we have read or received from Amnesty International, from Human Rights Watch, about the current situation in the Ivory Coast. I believe that if those kind of reports, were not out, certainly the same organization, the same Cote d'Ivoire Watch that have been watching the situation in the Ivory Coast right after the election will have still been on their position about the democratic nature or stature of Mr. Alassane Ouattara. These are two few things that I wanted to let out in here, but it is a good thing, I believe. And it is also a source of hope in terms of reconciliation, to be able now to acknowledge at least that in the Ivory Coast there have been atrocities committed on one side or the other. But again, as I said, these two things, what happened yesterday, the conclusion of the 10-day process at The Hague, and the recent reports from Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch are very key things. I'm not going to insist on them, but national reconciliation in the Ivory Coast, those who came before me, especially Dr. Gilpin, insisted on the economic aspect of it. I want to focus more on the constitutional aspect of it. Reason being that the crisis is very political. It is highly political, and there needs to be some legal solutions to that, or if you want, constitutional, right, solutions to that. Number one thing that we need to clear the way with is the notion of governments of reconciliation, the notion of a broad-based government, the notion of a national union, reconciliation or governments of national unions, etc., etc., etc. The reason why I'm saying this is that in the 1990s, and as a person who has participated into that myself, who participated into that, it was a time when we pushed for democracy. It was a time when the whole of Africa was shaking because we wanted the multi-party system to be there. By the end of the 1990s, it means that we are entering the 2000s. The whole of Africa today is talking about reconciliation because of the internal conflict that have made most of those African countries and the Ivory Coast happen to be one of them. Which means that the solutions that were brought to the table most of the time focused on creating broad-based government involving all the different parties in conflict, so-called. Those mechanisms proved very limited, very insufficient, and very a big failure, if you want. And examples are all across the board. We can talk about what happened in the Democratic Republic of Congo already. We can talk about what happened in Angola, even when Jonas Savimbi, who is now dead, was made the vice president of that country. And we can even quote the Ivory Coast, our own. From 2002, we have successively had different government, including, or what we call inclusive governments, with all the major political parties, but at the end of the day, we are still talking about reconciliation process. This should be a way for us to understand that somewhere there is a piece that is broken in that chain and in that way of thinking. And this also speaks onto what I call the constitutional aspect of it. The other thing I want to mention very quickly in here is the crisis that the Ivory Coast is going through happens to be the most important one. When I say the most important one, I'm looking at the damage. I'm looking at the consequences. The Ivory Coast has been, of course, independent since 1960. And we cannot say that throughout the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s that the Ivory Coast did not have any crisis or any social political crisis. Those who are from the Ivory Coast and those who have read, those who have studied the Ivory Coast will know that during the term of President Fubani, you have a different period of turmoil. But those turmoil did not go to the point of splitting the country into two for so long, into having the northern part of the country or other part, the northern part of the country under the sway of illegal people. I would say illegal because they were not elected to run that portion of the country, and then the exploitation of the mineral resources, and therefore the perpetuation of this kind of culture that Dr. Gilpin talked about, which is that the resources are in the hands of those who should not manage them. Therefore, you have this political economy of the conflict. And I give you some examples. Under President Ufobani, in 1967, and then you have some live, some witnesses of those periods in the room. I'm mentioning Dr. Pascal Kokora, former ambassador. 1967, young people, demanding a multi-party system in the Ivory Coast were put in jail. Following that, President Ufobani organized what we call the Days of National Council, which was his way of fostering national reconciliation. The same thing happened in 1969, 1970, and the last one that we witnessed ourselves happened in 1989, that we call the Day, les Journées du Dialogue, etc., etc., Days of Dialogue. That was his way of bringing, and at the end of each of these days of council, national council, what will happen is that President Fubani will move ahead and give amnesty or pardon those who were in jail. This is very important for us to understand in terms of what happened before in the country and how leaders were able to bring things together. Of course, we have so many other things we can say about the President of Fubani and so on and so forth. But the second thing is that aside from this kind of reconciliation, you also have these forums that were held. In 2001, under President Gbagbo, we have the Forum of National Reconciliation, which moved the country in a certain direction in the sense that, after that, we have this broad-based government, which was the first time in the Ivory Coast ever you have major political parties sitting in the same government. Aside from that, you also have individual, or let's say, initiatives by head of states. And here I want to mention Ufwebwanyi again, when in 1983, I believe, he met with those we call the leaders of the Sangwi people in Yamoussoukro to kind of ease the tensions. And in the 1990s, with President Bédié, two initiatives, because of the history of the Ivory Coast, about the Guébié people, what happened, and also what happened in the Abé people region where initiatives were very important. As we talked about that, and I mentioned that earlier very quick, the current crisis in the Ivory Coast cannot be matched with the previous ones, in the sense that none of them in the past have split the country the way it has been since 2002. Which means that the relevance of national reconciliation today is tremendous. And not only it is tremendous, but the task ahead of us is humongous. Let us put it this way. And because it is humongous, we need to look at the state of this reconciliation today. On May 19, 2011, Dr. Gilford, you remember? You were the first, 2013, which means technically 2 years after, and we are still having the same discussion. What does that mean? Very plainly, it means that, and this is my thesis regarding that, the Ivory Coast reconciliation is a mess, but despite the creation of the Dialogue, Reconciliation, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was created in July 2011, despite the rhetoric of the current regime, the Ivory Coast has made no substantial progress toward reconciliation. To speak more casually, it means there is no effort to reconcile the people of the Ivory Coast. Therefore, we are called, we need to step in. And the occasion of the trial of Mr. Laurent Gbagbo at The Hague, again, has, up to yesterday, uncovered the same contradiction and acrimonies, and I mean animosities that still exist. It is plain. Two examples to look at that. On the first day of the trial, there were debates, engaging, on the one hand, a person from what they call a pro-Gbagbo, terminology that I do not like, and on the other hand, a pro-Ouattara. The level of the debate, the content of the debate, and what was said, the atmosphere proved again that we have not made one step ahead. Therefore, where are we? I think those who came before me, especially Bernadette, mentioned that the security situation, which is key, which is important. There won't be any democracy in an insecure atmosphere. There won't be. And I think we agree on that. We don't even have to linger on that. We don't have to even to linger on the fact that the security forces and the police forces are destabilizing the Ivory Coast today. We cannot linger on the fact that the Dozo are still roaming today throughout the country. But I want to insist on the Dozo thing. The point in here again, and that touched again on the constitutional aspect of this, is that culturally, and this is also an aspect of this reconciliation process, the fact that historically our people are already, I don't want to say afraid, but they have a sort of contention with the police forces and security forces and military forces because of the way those forces were created during the colonial time. And when you add onto that those who naturally and culturally belong to an area, which is the northern part of the Ivory Coast, roaming the southern part of the Ivory Coast, or villages that we call southerners, it creates a cultural problem. There is a cultural problem there. And somebody mentioned identity. That's the problem of identity. It is not part of people's culture in there, and it creates a lot of tensions. We can move on to talk about, the prevalence of the victor's justice, and I'm not going to talk about, that in detail because, Bernadette touched upon that, and I agree with her on that. But the fact that you have more than 500 people in jail today, known or unknown, the fact that you have about 1,500 police officers or former police officers or military officers in jail today, these are things that cannot technically create an atmosphere of political dialogue to generate reconciliation. And then the third point, very quick, I'm going to enumerate them, the unwillingness of the current regime, right, for political dialogue, right? The manipulation of the electoral game, we talk about today. But the fragmentation of the Ivorian society is another key issue that we need to look at. Seriously fragmented. Today, I will say that, personally, we are even looking at situations of anger that are now residing not just on the faces, but they are inside. And this is something that, we really need to acknowledge and tackle. At the same time, the question of identity, the question of citizenship, and the question of land ownership are also very important for us to look at. And another issue is how the current regime got into power. How the current regime got into power is also important in fostering this reconciliation of bringing people together. I think Bernadette again, mentioned that it is not something that you jump at today and you believe that the success will be yesterday. It means that to move toward reconciliation, we have to follow a gradual path, step by step. The last point, in it here before I jump to my suggestions, and Bernadette again mentioned that, and I want to catch her on that really quick. She said something, which is that for reconciliation in the Ivory Coast, the process has to be owned by the Ivorians themselves. Very important, and I agree with you. But what does that mean to be owned by the Ivorians? Not that the Ivorians are the stooges implementing what is being dictated, but the Ivorians themselves invent the wheels, weave the helm, if there needs be. Reason why I can, again, use the stage to once again call upon the fact that the tremendous unconditional support that Mr. Ouattara in the Ivory Coast has received from the international community is also part of the problem. Is also part of the problem. For 2 years, those same exactions that are being reported today by Amnesty International just come in to corroborate what we have been saying, or what the Ivorians have been saying, what Bintu has been saying about the victims in the Ivory Coast. It is not what Bintu is saying, what I am saying, or what anybody else is saying, which is corroborating theirs, but theirs is actually corroborating us. This is what I call the process of owning the mechanism of this reconciliation. In March 2011, the Obama administration issued a release. Obama himself spoke for 5 minutes about the importance of for the Ivorians to accept Mr. Ouattara as the president because he will foster democracy, peace, and reconciliation. Mr. Obama said that. But the question again with the international community is this, that at the same time and building on the Accra speech of 2009, why has it taken so long for that same administration to actually pull the string and say, wait a minute, there is something not going on right in the direction of peace, reconciliation, and democracy. Very quick, my suggestions. Number 1, the boundaries. An African-based reconciliation, but not a reconciliation made in France, as we have seen. In other words, the claim that what President Gbagbo is making all the time about him being removed from power by the French stands. If I'm a referee for American football that I love, I will say the ruling stands. In other words, it is overturned if we are in a court of justice, to speak as Bernadette Power here. But second thing, the respect of the fundamental law, which means the respect of the Constitution. And I think all of us are speaking about that. The rule of law is based on Constitution. The respect of the electoral game or the democratic game is also based on the Constitution. And then the third boundary in here is the commitment of the current regime, of course, with its international partners to the question of reconciliation and genuine reconciliation. Ending all forms of impunity, the question of justice that should go with truth, but more important also the question of reparation and forgiveness. I have seen in the mechanism people talking about forgiveness and then reparation. I think that the other way around is more possible. When reparation takes place, forgiveness can follow more quickly. some important question that needs to be addressed. I will start with this one, the land tenure issue, the citizenship issue, the regional integration issue for the Ivory Coast, and that goes back to what Abintu has said in the beginning about what the Ivory Coast used to be, and ending on that point, what the Ivory Coast used to be years ago under President Gbagbo in terms of regional integration. We need to reinvent, we need to rethink this mechanism, because the Ivory Coast of 1960 has 2 million people with a land area of about 16 million hectares of forest. Today, the Ivory Coast has more than 20 million inhabitants with a less land reserves. So the situations are completely different. President Foubouin did his. What do we do now with this situation and this picture that we have? The reform in the police sector and the army. It is impossible to keep having this destabilization of the police forces, the security force in the Ivory Coast, which will create other problems. And I believe that national cohesion is also another thing we need to address. And finally, it may not please many, but again, since the crisis is also political, and very political indeed, since we talk about the post-electoral crisis, and the question was raised a long time ago, how do we get, from a constitutional perspective, respecting all aspects of those constitutions, left and right, how do we resolve the matter of the last presidential election in the Ivory Coast, which is still standing, not in the minds of the international community maybe, but in the minds of those Ivorians that we want to bring to the table of reconciliation. And I'll end by saying this. The people of the Ivory Coast, I'm sure, whether they're from the south, from the north, from the east, from the west, want to live a peaceful life. Not because somebody else from outside wants them to do so, but because they believe and they are convinced that it should be so for themselves. We are here in the United States, and if me, Dr. Gilpie, and I can stand side by side and have this casual, friendly discussion, is because of this peaceful environment that we have. So therefore, I want to end on that with my presentation. Thank you so much again for having us.